Now let's cover the evidence of a global flood, because the scriptures isn't describing a local, mythical, or esoteric event. This worldwide event can be proven with science because the evidence is all over the planet. So let's cover that evidence. Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
Hey guys, it's Mike Chen. I did a video a while ago about the hollow earth theory, and if you missed it, I'll put the link for you guys in my description box. In that video, I talked about a 2014 report where researchers from the University of Alberta obtained a small diamond from Brazil that contained a mineral called ringwoodite. The ringwoodite was significant because water was trapped inside it, and it was formed about 250 to 350 miles below the planet's surface in the so-called transition zone between the upper and lower mantle. This finding suggests that there's an ocean inside the Earth, and that ocean might have as much water as all the world's oceans put together. Now, the theory that a vast water reservoir existing inside the planet is gaining more traction because two new studies suggest that there may indeed be vast quantities of water as far as 620 miles below the surface. In the first study, researchers from Florida State University and the University of Edinburgh estimated that water exists around 250 to 370 miles into the mantle. The water is stored and transported through a high-pressure form of the mineral brucite. Minerals such as brucite decompose deep in the earth, and as they decompose, they release water, which is recycled back to the Earth's surface via volcanic activity. They estimate the amount of water inside the Earth is around 1.5% of the weight of the planet, which is equal to all the ocean's waters put together. In another study, researchers from Northwestern University in Illinois discovered a diamond that made its way to the surface 90 million years ago. The diamond had an imperfection containing minerals that became trapped during the diamond's formation. When researchers looked at it under the microscope, they saw evidence of the presence of hydroxyl ions, which normally come from water. And the nature of the imperfection suggests that the diamond was formed in the lower mantle. And here's the thing, researchers say if there is indeed that much water inside our planet, and they think there is, if that water dries up, then we all die. Because water inside the Earth is helping mantle convection, which is the process in which heat is transferred from the Earth's core to its surface. Now, if there was no water inside the Earth, then mantle convection stops, which will bring an end to all volcanic activities. And if all volcanic activities stop, then planetary activities will eventually stop as well. You know what's crazy is that we've been taught ever since elementary school that the inside of the Earth looks like this, but did you know that the deepest we've ever gotten inside the Earth is only around 8 miles, and everything else is just a theory. So yeah.
Natural history museums have displays and animations that try to make the case that the continents were once joined in a formation called Pangaea and then slowly moved apart to their current locations over tens of millions of years. Well, it's actually quite obvious that the continents were in fact together at one time. Evolutionists and creationists agree on this point. But did they really spread apart over millions of years, or did it happen rapidly, even within just 1 year, during the flood of Noah's time? Stay tuned to find out. The conventional idea presented in museums is that Pangaea began breaking apart about 175 million years ago, and the continents have been moving apart slowly to their current locations. Today, we can use GPS measurements to confirm the direction and speed of their movement, which is in fact just inches per year. But has it always been this way, with the continents moving apart slowly? Actually, it hasn't, and we'll explain why this is the case, both biblically and scientifically. The Bible records that Noah's flood commenced when the fountains of the great deep began breaking open. The Hebrew term used for this is ba-ka, which means to cleave, rend, or break and rip open, to make a breach. This couldn't describe what we see any better. One of the largest tears, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, includes perpendicular faults along its entire length, showing the formation of new seafloor that occurred rapidly during the flood, not slowly over millions of years. The raised and sloped features on each side of the rift also testify to the hot and buoyant rock that still lies beneath it. This is certainly something that happened quickly in the past and then slowed down greatly, as GPS measurements today indicate. The Bible describes these breached fountains of the Great Deep resulted in flooding the whole earth, with the highest hills being covered by over 20 feet of water. Everything that moved on land outside the ark died. After pouring years of study into the mechanics of the flood, 6 PhD scientists published a research paper titled Catastrophic Plate Tectonics, a global flood model of Earth history. The research revealed that fast-moving subducting oceanic plates were responsible for the continents breaking apart and spreading to their current locations, in contrast to the evolutionary ideas of slow continental drift and equally slow seafloor spreading. Ongoing research in this area has shown that this model also helps to explain volcanoes, mountain ranges, the shapes and positions of continents, and the generation of global tsunamis that explain rock layers. As a professional scientist, Dr. John Baumgartner has studied the flood and its mechanisms for over 40 years. Dr. Baumgartner is known for developing Terra, a computer program that investigates the flow of rock within the Earth's mantle. In 1997, U.S. News and World Report described him as the world's preeminent expert in the design of computer models for geophysical convection. Baumgartner has applied Terra to demonstrate that the Earth's mantle is indeed vulnerable to runaway instability, and that this instability is capable of resurfacing the planet in the time span of just a few months. We'll review many of these findings next. First, scientists of both creation and evolutionary persuasions agree that new ocean crust forms at ocean rift zones where 2 tectonic plates are moving apart. The plates in the rift migrate apart. Magma rises to fill the gap, is cooled by ocean water, and solidifies to make a strip of new ocean crust. The 2 plates are like conveyor belts that move away from the rift zone along one edge and usually toward a subduction zone along the other edge. At the subduction zone, the moving plate plunges into the mantle beneath and thus disappears from the surface. The main difference between creationist and secular understanding is that, in creationist understanding, during the flood, plate speeds were about 5 miles per hour instead of just a few inches per year, as measured today. The much higher speed is why the process during the flood is referred to as catastrophic plate tectonics. Next, we'll review some of the strong evidence supporting this theory, starting first with the big picture, then investigating some of the physical evidences in more detail. One of the clearest evidences is that the continents fit together like puzzle pieces. While many school textbooks credit Alfred Wegener with the discovery that the continents drifted from an original supercontinent like Pangaea to their current location, it was actually a Bible-believing scientist named Antonio Snider Pellegrini who brought this to light much earlier and published it in his 1858 book titled The Creation and Its Mysteries Unveiled. His theory was based on the biblical flood account, the obvious shape and fitting of the continents, and the fact that plant fossils found in both Europe and the United States were identical. We can see evidence around the world that the continents fit together. Just check out this map with all the ocean water removed. The deep continental shelves become visible, and we can see how the continents fit together like puzzle pieces to shape an Earth that used to be mostly a single landmass. This is especially obvious when looking at the matching jagged edges of lower South America and Africa. We can also see this notch of submerged land off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland and how it perfectly fits into a slot north of Spain. From a biblical standpoint, the continents fit together so well because of the catastrophic linear rifting that occurred when the fountains of the Great Deep were cleaved and pulled apart just thousands of years ago. We can see how the oceanic ridge system fits this biblical explanation well, covering more than 40,000 miles and circling the Earth 1.6 times over. The next evidence is the Ring of Fire, which is a 25,000-mile horseshoe-shaped string of oceanic trenches in the Pacific Ocean basin, where about 90% of the world's earthquakes and a large fraction of the world's volcanoes occur. It is also where most of the plate subduction is taking place today. From a biblical perspective, this long belt of volcanoes and earthquakes marks the location where vast amounts of ocean plate was rapidly subducted into the Earth's interior during the flood. Today, by comparison, the speed of subduction is extremely slow, and the resulting earthquakes and tsunamis are dramatically less frequent. During the flood, however, oceanic plates were subducting much faster, a process known as runaway subduction, caused by regions of cooler rock in the upper part sinking downward toward the bottom, and the regions of warmer rock at the bottom rising upward toward the surface. Once set into motion, this process of rapid rising and sinking can run away, causing the plates to move on the order of 5 miles per hour, much faster than today's plate speed of just inches per year. From a biblical perspective, the runaway episode is the mechanism that brought worldwide flooding and tsunamis responsible for wiping out all terrestrial life on Earth outside the ark. Computer experiments confirm these episodes of runaway subduction are inevitable under the right conditions. A major consequence of the rapid plate motion is the generation of a huge number of giant tsunamis. In today's world, at an ocean trench where an oceanic plate is steadily slipping into the mantle, the adjacent overriding plate generally is locked against it, and it is bent downward as the other plate slides into the mantle. As this motion proceeds, the overriding plate is deformed more and more in a spring-like manner until a stress limit is exceeded. At this point, the two plates unlock, significant slip between the plates occur, and the overriding plate returns to its original shape. Such an unlocking and slip event usually produces an earthquake and, in many cases, launches a tsunami. During the flood, when plate speeds were much faster than today, this same locking and unlocking phenomenon also prevailed. The higher plate speeds and the huge amount of seafloor recycled into the mantle would have generated vast numbers of huge tsunamis with wave heights in the range of hundreds of feet. The major result of rapid plate motion is the formation of the observed layer cake pattern of fossil-bearing sediments across the continents. More tsunamis today occur by this same action, but they occur much less frequently. For example, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan, and the fourth largest in history, was a magnitude 9.1 earthquake that occurred in 2011. This earthquake was caused by an undersea megathrust about 45 miles east of the coast of Japan. At the center, there was a 160-foot slip between the overriding plate that was part of Japan and the underlying Pacific plate. The sea bottom rose about 23 feet when the fault unlocked, and the resulting earthquake triggered a devastating tsunami that was 133 feet above sea level and traveled inland for 6 miles. The tsunamis occurring during the flood, however, were different, much different, with the ocean ridge bursting open rapidly and pushing the ocean floor under land continents on a worldwide scale. Tsunamis were happening in cycles, several every hour, and with the long stretches of subduction zones active at the same time. The incoming phase of a tsunami has a much higher speed and is highly turbulent, which keeps the sediment in suspension but leaves behind layers of sediment as it slows down. In the retreating phase, this cycle repeats several times every hour during the 150-day inundation stage of the flood, first entombing the shallow marine life, followed by land creatures in different habitats and elevations, leaving behind what we see today in the fossil record. These types of tsunamis have even occurred in recent history, such as the tsunami caused by slipping ocean plates that hit the coast of Washington in 1700 and left behind multiple layers representing each wave of the tsunami. The next evidence that supports CPT is that the plates, which rapidly subducted under the continents during the flood, are still visible. Seismic images of the mantle reveal a ring of unexpectedly cold rock at the bottom of the mantle, beneath the subduction zones that surround the Pacific Ocean. Seismic tomography shows the cold plates in blue that subducted under the continents during the flood. We can also see the Farallon plate that subducted under North America, and the process of its subduction was the very formation of the Rocky Mountains. Evolutionists explain how oceanic plates, like the Farallon plate, slowly subducted over tens of millions of years under the North American continent uneventfully, while the millions of dinosaurs now buried in this kill zone somehow just kept living and thriving. Both secular and creation scientists agree that the Farallon plate subducted under North America, even carrying massive volcanic plateaus like the Conjugate Shatsky Rise along with it, going from the west to the east. But we disagree, and with good reason, that the dinosaurs somehow just kept peacefully thriving in this area while this was happening. This subducting action would be like a spatula sliding beneath an undercooked pancake, creating massive folding and buckling just like we see all over North America today. The process even explains the rapid and catastrophic formation of the Rocky Mountains. This happened just thousands of years ago during Noah's flood, when the fountains of the Great Deep were broken apart and the year-long process of the worldwide flood unfolded. Next, we have the extensive worldwide fossil record. The oceanic plates that subducted rapidly under land masses generated cycles of tsunamis that brought staggering quantities of sediment onto land that wiped out every living creature in their paths, burying them in the muddy layers we still see today. Giant high-frequency tsunamis that were occurring during the flood explain why today we see dinosaur graveyards around the world, including 13 states in the middle of America containing dead dinosaurs mixed with marine life. What type of flood could do this? Just how much water would it take to bury millions of land creatures under hundreds of feet of mud and sand in the Morrison Formation, a 13-state, 700,000 square mile area? Just how did so many land creatures get buried together with marine life, with 97% of the dinosaurs found disarticulated, and many of the remaining 3% that are found intact discovered in mud and sand layers with their necks arched back, suffocating as they died? Next, we have evidence from secular geologists that the Cretaceous fossils are higher in elevation than rising sea levels alone could produce. There had to be some serious catastrophic buckling of the layers laid down by the CPT process while the layers were still wet and foldable. North America provides some clues to the massive nature of the flood. In fact, even secular geologists refer to what's known as the widespread late Cretaceous transgression, which is just technical jargon for worldwide flood. Studies have revealed that a sea level rise of 310 meters is required to flood the Cretaceous layers based on their current elevation. However, the maximum thickness of the fossil layers produced by a 310-meter sea level rise is only about 700 meters. The challenge is that in North America, nearly 50% of the Cretaceous layers contain strata thicker than 700 meters, indicating that the continents had to sink and buckle during this global inundation. This is exactly what the catastrophic nature of the flood would have done. There's just no way that rising sea levels alone can explain the fossil record in North America. Something much more catastrophic that warped and submerged the continents just had to be involved. Next, we have one of the strongest evidences for the fast, catastrophic separation of the continents: fossil correlation. Secular textbooks and museums admit that fossils of the same species are found on matching sides of continents that were once together, but are now separated by over 3,000 miles of ocean. Did this happen slowly over millions of years, as museums state, or quickly over a year during Noah's flood? To find out, let's zoom in on two areas where matching fossils exist, straddling thousands of miles of ocean in between. Look at northeastern Brazil and where it was once situated in this notch on Africa's west coast. Do you know that multitudes of the same species lived in the area where these two areas were once joined? In each of these areas, there are dozens of fossil beds where the same species of marine and land creatures are buried together in the very mud layers that killed them, including bivalves, ammonites, and multiple types of dinosaurs. If these continents really split apart over tens of millions of years, then why are the same exact creatures and plants found on matching sides of the continents? Indeed, the same creatures in the same habitat were once thriving here. Then the flood broke, and catastrophic rifting pushed these land masses thousands of miles apart from each other. It's so obvious. Here all these animals lie, locked in their muddy graves in the same exact area they were living before the flood broke, but now they are buried in the very mud that killed them. Heading south, we see the same situation, but this location is even more interesting. The lower regions of South America and the northern tip of Antarctica have dinosaur fossils on them, including hadrosaurs, Ankylosaurus, theropods, and others that supposedly emerged and died off during the late Cretaceous period. However, evolutionary geologists hold that these two areas were never even connected during the entire time these dinosaur species supposedly showed up and then died off during the evolutionary timeline. This means we should not expect to find matching fossils in South America and Antarctica, yet we do. Therefore, the animals that were fossilized there had to be living in this area when the continents were joined. They were killed and buried when this region was catastrophically torn apart. Many trilobite species also straddle both sides of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and testify to the rapid nature of this catastrophe, with millions of the same kinds of animals that were once living together now found buried in mud and lime layers on either side. The evolutionary view holds that these continents moved apart slowly over millions of years. If this was true, the large rivers on the continents that straddle each sides of these rifts would have left a connected trail of mud stretching from one side of the Atlantic to the other. But what we see from the evidence is that they were rapidly split apart, and then the draining and erosion started. Major rivers like the Congo, Mississippi, and Amazon run off the continents and have mud fans with only thousands of years worth of mud deposits, not millions. Also, there are flat sand bottoms on each side of these continents, showing they were split apart rapidly. They don't have millions of years worth of runoff with extensive mud extending out into the ocean. These rivers began shaping and eroding only thousands of years ago, not millions. We also have the massive coal and oil deposits all around the world, indicating that the entire world was reshaped from the original Pangaea Formation with vast amounts of sediment covering and compressing the pre-flood landscape that was full of vegetation and life. Just the sheer amount of coal attests that the actions involved with catastrophic plate tectonics explain how countless megatons of pre-flood landscapes were buried during the same process that reconfigured the continents. Let's not forget about entire regions of ash deposits that are buried along with the dinosaurs. The volcanoes responsible for this ash were created by the rapidly subducting plates, again explained by catastrophic plate tectonics. The data supporting catastrophic plate tectonics being responsible for the breakup of Pangaea is overwhelming. We have torn apart continents that once fit together, a 40,000-mile rift system, a massive mid-Atlantic ridge, subducted ocean plates around the world, a ring of fire from where the plates are still subducting, a massive fossil record with the same types of creatures now separated by thousands of miles of ocean, river fans that were laid down after the continents separated, volumes of coal and oil from the rapidly buried pre-flood landscape, and ash generated by volcanoes erupting from the motion set in place by the rapidly subducting plates. Evolutionists and creationists have the same data, but this data is interpreted through worldview lenses that lead to very different conclusions. Evolution's Pangaea split apart millions of years ago by random processes and led to the configuration of Earth today. If the Bible is correct, Pangaea was a pre-flood paradise that became marred with sin, and the resulting judgment from God left behind a trail of incredibly obvious markers that Earth was catastrophically reshaped during the biblical flood.
To some, the idea of Noah's flood conjures up images from Sunday school Bible stories of a small boat overstuffed with cute animals that gently bobbed in an ocean for 40 days. Many simply call it a myth. Fewer and fewer these days believe the flood account from Genesis 6 to 9 is actual history. The Bible frames the flood as an actual historical event, one that involved a specific family of 8. Genesis says the flood lasted for a full year, engulfed the entire world, and preserved animals, plants, and humanity from well-deserved judgment. The flood represents the most detailed account of any single event in the Bible. Both the Apostle Peter and Jesus even referred to the Genesis flood as a real historical event. So it's safe to say that the credibility of the Bible, and even Jesus himself, hinges on whether the flood account actually happened as described in Genesis. Join us now as we reveal how Noah's flood lines up with brand new scientific research. Over 1,800 oil well boreholes from 4 continents have all been compiled and mapped. The newly emerging map tracks the thickness and extent of each rock type as they were laid down by the flood. This research reveals the same 6 megasequences of sedimentary rock deposits across multiple continents. Each megasequence contains a huge stack of rock, often with coarse-grained sandstone on the bottom, then finer-grained deposits like shale, then topped by limestones. Each megasequence is bounded above and below by flat, eroded surfaces called unconformities. A few places on Earth have layers that represent all 6 megasequences. How did they get there? What do they say about Noah's flood? Catastrophically water-deposited sedimentary layers top most of the world's continents. Would Noah's flood bring lots of water and lots of mud? Geologists agree on the 6 megasequences, but they differ on the timescale in which they happened. If they took millions of years, then they have little to do with the flood, but if they were all deposited rapidly and recently, then the flood should come to mind. Many also question when a larger landmass, such as a Pangaea-like supercontinent, broke into continents that moved to their current configuration. For the first time ever, new megasequence maps allow us to see how the flood shaped our entire planet, just like the Bible said, including reconfiguring the continents. According to Genesis, the Garden of Eden was a lush paradise, one that was set up for eternal life, worldwide vegetarianism, and harmony with our Creator. There was no bloodshed, disease, or even death. Plants and trees had no thorns or thistles, and humans tended God's creation. Then came the fall. We disobeyed God and ate the forbidden fruit. Sin entered the world, and death through sin. Suffering, pain, mutations, and cancer now plagued humanity. Plants and trees grew thorns, and we transitioned from keepers of a lush garden to laboring farmers. The earth and universe began to decay and groan under the weight of sin's curse. Not even 2,000 years later, humanity had turned so corrupt that God sent the flood as a judgment against us. For God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." God instructed Noah to make an ark, a word that means box or chest, to specific dimensions, materials, and construction. And Noah did according unto all that the Lord commanded him. And Noah and his family entered the ark along with 2 of every basic kind of land-dwelling, air-breathing animal with nostrils. These add up to about 5,000 pairs of animal kinds needed to reproduce all the variety in animal life we have today. Then, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. These 2 events, the fountains of the great deep breaking up and the windows of heaven opening, began the first day of a 371-day-long calamity that resurfaced the earth and killed everything that moved on land. Hot magma mixed with steam pierced the earth's crust. Giant rifts or tears ran thousands of miles across the planet. Scalding hot magma vaporized massive amounts of water that jetted into the atmosphere. The water fell back to Earth as intense global rain, along with torrential rain from heaven for 40 days. Worldwide catastrophic rifting caused massive mud-filled tsunamis to speed across deep ocean floors, then onto shallow ocean floors, killing everything in their path. The first mega-sequence wipes out mostly shallow marine habitats. The bursting fountains of the great deep spew out megatons of magma and carbon dioxide. Sure enough, the first mega-sequence rocks show a spike in volcanic activity and massive amounts of carbon dioxide. During these first 40 days, intense water currents overtopped most of the flooded continents. Water-laden sediment travels at highway speeds. Thick sediment blankets start covering low regions of the continent. Fossils show that the first 3 mega-sequences buried the shallow seas that were filled with marine life, as these deposits have almost no trees or land animals. All 3 mega-sequences covered similar environments across North and South America and Africa, the 3 continents mapped so far. One global cause, Noah's flood, best explains this one worldwide effect. Then by the 40th day of the flood, the Absaroka mega-sequence began hitting. The maps show that this is when things got much worse. Something shoves the water over the tops of even the high lands from that ancient world. The newly forming ocean floor offshore is so hot that it starts very thick, pushing up the ocean waters from beneath. Sea level rises dramatically. Molten magma rises and fills the widening gaps, pushing the mid-ocean ridges wider. The hot ocean floor shoves against the continents, then slides beneath them, like giant conveyor belts, deep beneath the earth in some places. Rather than the conventional model that has the seafloors spreading slowly, this runaway subduction actually happened quickly, moving at about 5 miles per hour, due to the heat caused by the friction and pressure of the rapidly subducting plates. As the diving ocean plates subduct under the land, they push down the continental edges and then release them, creating tsunami cycles that blanket the continents, just how tsunamis happen today, only more intense and frequent. For example, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan, and the 4th largest in history, was a magnitude 9.1 earthquake that occurred in 2011. This earthquake was caused by an undersea megathrust about 45 miles east of the Japanese coast. At the center, there was a 160-foot slip between the overriding plate that was part of Japan and the underlying Pacific plate. The sea bottom rose about 23 feet when the fault unlocked, and the resulting earthquake triggered a devastating tsunami that was 133 feet above sea level and traveled inland for 6 miles. The tsunamis occurring during the flood, however, were different, much different. With the ocean ridge bursting open rapidly and pushing the ocean floor under land continents on a worldwide scale, tsunamis were happening in cycles, several every hour, and with long stretches of subduction zones active at the same time. The incoming phase of a tsunami has a much higher speed and is highly turbulent, which keeps the sediment in suspension. but it leaves behind layers of sediment as it slows down in the retreating phase. This cycle repeats several times every hour during the 150-day inundation stage of the flood, first entombing the shallow marine life, followed by land creatures in different habitats and elevations, leaving behind what we see today in the fossil record. These types of tsunamis have even occurred in recent history, such as the tsunami caused by slipping ocean plates that hit the coast of Washington in 1700 and left behind multiple layers representing each wave of the tsunami. Recent seismic technology actually allows us to investigate whether this type of rapid subduction occurred. Sure enough, these scans reveal a ring of unexpectedly cold rock at the bottom of the mantle, beneath the subduction zones that surround the Pacific Ocean. The severity and elevation of this stage of the flood is why the first land creatures and plants start showing up in the fossil record laid down by the Absaroka megasequence. Entire ecosystems are buried in enormous deposits that later turn into coal, such as the extensive Appalachian coal beds. In fact, the U.S. has over 7 trillion tons of coal reserves. Where did it all come from? While we know that coal is formed by dead plant material being sandwiched between sediment layers, we only have enough vegetation on the Earth's surface today to produce just a fraction of the existing coal reserves. This shows that the pre-flood world was mostly covered by lush vegetation. The rising floodwaters and tsunamis that were necessary to sweep over the land and bury vast amounts of vegetation that turned into coal are best explained by a catastrophe of worldwide proportions. The fact that over a dozen states in the U.S. are filled with dinosaur fossils buried under heaps of mud also attests to the flood. In fact, geologists have found a temporarily exposed dinosaur peninsula where the dinosaurs made their last stand, now buried there along with lake and sea life transported by the massive waves. The earlier flood deposits, the first 3 megasequences, do not seem to have deposited much material over this dinosaur peninsula. Only a few hundred yards of sediment remain along the margins, and in many places, no deposition is left at all. Deposits thousands of feet thick occur east and west of this temporarily exposed peninsula that extends from Minnesota to New Mexico. Now buried across it are pre-flood wetland plants and animals, including dinosaurs, turtles, frogs, fish, and many birds. Thousands of dinosaur trackways up and down this peninsula, plus similar temporarily exposed low areas on other continents, suggest that dying dinosaurs and other hardy track makers floated, waded, and walked on freshly deposited mud, trying to find safe ground. Next, the massive Zuni megasequence hits. The Absaroka and Zuni megasequences are the most severe because the continental plates began to move more quickly from the original Pangaea-like supercontinent configuration to where they are today. With oceanic rifting and plate subduction increasing dramatically and the continents traveling apart quickly, the tsunami-like waves began washing across western North America while virtually no sedimentation is occurring in the east. When coming up over the Dinosaur Peninsula, the Zuni catastrophically buries dinosaurs in the Morrison Formation, a 13-state area encompassing over 700,000 square miles. This Jurassic unit includes at least 141 massive dinosaur boneyards where dinosaurs like Camarasaurus, Diplodocus, Apatosaurus, Stegosaurus, and Allosaurus are found. The Cretaceous layers, like the Hill Creek Formation, are found on top of the Jurassic and hold hundreds of mass boneyards containing several different types of dinosaurs, such as T-Rex, Triceratops, Centrosaurus, and Edmontosaurus that had been living in a different ecosystem, also buried by the Zuni. The Zuni was so massive and fast that it engulfed entire regions with mudflow, burying giant creatures like this T-Rex under 50 feet of muddy sediment, entombed so quickly that preserved blood cells, blood vessels, and bone cells were found just recently. How much water does it take to pile 50 feet of mud on top of a dinosaur? The Dinosaur National Monument in Utah contains thousands of visible bones from 11 kinds of dinosaurs that were buried in a jumbled mass in the Morrison Formation, together with crocodiles, turtles, lizards, frogs, and clams. What type of event would it take to bury all these different land animals with millions of clams? When the Dinosaur Peninsula floods over completely, large herds of dinosaurs are entombed in massive fossil graveyards in the Upper Cretaceous system found in northern Wyoming, Montana, and Alberta, Canada. The dinosaurs had tried to escape by fleeing northward up the peninsula as waters advanced from the south. This explains this massive graveyard in northern Montana that's over 1.2 miles long and contains 30 million fossil fragments, representing over 10,000 adult Maiasaura that were simultaneously buried. In this entire collection of bones, not a single baby was found. Every one of these 10,000 Maiasaura was between 9 and 23 feet long. Does this seem like the adult dinosaurs were stampeding away from the raging floodwaters, with 100% of their young falling behind and being engulfed in a different part of the peninsula? Just 170 miles northeast of this location is one of the largest dinosaur graveyards in the world, one that even secular scientists admit was caused by a watery catastrophe. Here, thousands of centrosaurs are buried in 14 mega bone beds over an entire square mile, which is nearly 500 football fields. Looks like a massive herd of these creatures, thousands of them, were simultaneously buried in mud by Noah's flood. Just 45 miles west from this location is yet another massive flood deposit, and this one even has 49 different species of dinosaurs buried along with turtles, crocodiles, fish, flying reptiles, birds, and small mammals. What type of disaster could bury nearly 50 species of dinosaurs and many other types of animals, including marine life, together in mass graves? These mass burial sites are common in the U.S. as well. For example, look at this dinosaur dig site in Wyoming, where a 1-meter thick layer of mudstone stretches for 80 acres, with over 1 million bones buried in a graded, sorted bed where big bones are found at the bottom and little bones on top. The only way to develop a graded bed like this is by a catastrophic process that transports these bones and deposits them during a single event. Large flying creatures like pterosaurs were able to fly to escape the rising floodwaters, delaying their demise until the later stages of the flood. The fossil record shows they are buried in many different layers all over the world. There's no doubt that widespread volcanism was also involved in finishing off the dinosaurs, as many of these mass graves are literally packed with volcanic ash, ash that in many cases was mixed with water when it emplaced the dinosaurs in their tombs. One section of the Morrison Formation, called the Brushy Basin Member, spreads across 5 states and includes over 4,000 cubic miles of volcanic materials. Without a single volcano in the Morrison Formation, geologists believe this material had to be carried all the way from volcanoes on the west coast, volcanoes created by the magma rising from the subducting ocean crusts plunging under the land. Today, these subduction zones form the Ring of Fire, responsible for over 90% of our earthquakes. The Bible records that on the 150th day of the flood, God made a wind to pass over the earth. The waters started to recede. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. Now enters the final mega sequence, the Tejas. Here, after the water peaked over the top of the highest remnant of the pre-flood world, it began to rush off the continents, eroding and reworking some of the deposits laid down in the previous mega sequences, especially carving away at the Zuni deposits. This final sequence appears to have been different than the others, because there was a reversal in flow direction as the waters began to sheet off the continents. This flow reversal transported much of the fossils deposited earlier off the highest uplands, spreading them towards the edges of the continent. The evidence points to the Tejas draining the floodwaters southward off of the U.S. towards the Gulf of Mexico with a sheet wash pattern all at once. This is why we find massive sand deposits in the deep water of the Gulf of Mexico. Billions of barrels of oil have been discovered there, with much of it found within a massive 1,100-foot thick bed of pure sand in over 7,000 feet of water, over 200 miles offshore. In addition, plants swept off the pre-flood lands formed massive coal beds, such as in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming and Montana. These Tejas layers contain the largest coal deposits in North America that currently supplies over 40% of the coal in the U.S. Some of these stacked coal beds are up to 200 feet thick and cover areas that are 60 miles long by 60 miles wide. The sheer volume of plant material required to form such a massive layer of coal testifies to catastrophic circumstances. The massive runoff that began with the Tejas may also explain the lack of human fossils in the rock record. Any residual human remains left buried in earlier deposits were totally destroyed by the erosive, retreating floodwaters. In line with God's promise to wipe them from the face of the earth, Any residual remains were ground up and likely spread in all directions over great distances by the Tejas, lessening the likelihood of finding any human fossil remains. Because humans were impacted earlier by the flood's violence, they were destroyed and thus not buried whole deep in the sediments, leaving no fossil traces. Erosion in the Tejas sequence would have affected the strata beneath, wiping away even traces of human remains buried in earlier layers. When God stopped the fountains of the Great Deep on day 150, the new ocean surface began cooling and sinking, allowing the floodwaters to lower as they sheeted off the continents into the new ocean basins. Psalm 104 describes the mountains being raised at the end of the flood, and the waters draining down valleys and off the emerging new land surfaces. The seafloor rifting process and the resulting mountain forming process explains why sea creatures are found on mountaintops all over the world, high above current sea levels. For the remaining 220 days of the flood, the water recedes from the earth and it dries out, allowing time for earth to be replenished with vegetation for the animals to eat when they eventually come off the ark. This year-long catastrophe left behind a vast number of proofs that, quite frankly, make its occurrence obvious. First, we have the staggering volume of fossil-bearing sedimentary rocks around the world. Over 1 mile thick on average, billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And the sediment they're found in lies above sea level. What sort of water process could emplace so much sediment above sea level on top of the land surface? Another clue is the vast horizontal extent of individual sediment layers with little to no erosional channeling between successive layers. What sort of transport and depositional process could conceivably generate such uniform layers over such vast horizontal distances? Many of these layered beds are separated by bedding planes on the scale of inches to feet, a feature so common that few stop to think about how it happened. It's as if the sediment is being deposited in pulses in a repeating manner, with each pulse producing a thin layer commonly found around the world. The flood tsunamis provide a perfect explanation, and it happened so quickly that there was no time between deposition of the layers for surviving critters to burrow into the layers and churn them over. What has been discovered, both from a creationist as well as from a secular understanding, is that much of the continental fossil record was already in place before any of the present-day ocean crust had come into existence at a rift zone. For example, all of the trilobite fossils had been deposited, plus all of the older coal deposits had already been formed before any of the present-day ocean crust had formed. Since in creationist understanding, the presence of fossils is a completely trustworthy indicator of the action of the flood, this means that much of the flood cataclysm had already unfolded and had generated fossil-bearing sediments on the continental surface before any of the present-day ocean floor had appeared. It further implies that all of today's ocean floor formed since the onset of the flood, during roughly the latter half of the cataclysm. It also means that all of the pre-flood ocean floor, plus the ocean floor formed during the earlier portion of the flood, must have been recycled into the Earth's interior during the cataclysm. These considerations indicate in a compelling way that rapid plate tectonics must have been a major aspect of the year-long flood catastrophe. This 6 megasequence worldwide flooding process perfectly set the stage for the subsequent ice age. The oceans had been tremendously heated by the rifting that had taken place across the 45,000-mile ridge system, and the creation of a completely new seafloor of hot lava as a consequence. This caused an abnormal amount of evaporation, and thus continuous rain that was likely worldwide. The volcanic activity created by the subduction zones that created the Ring of Fire would have spewed volumes of ash and aerosols high into the atmosphere, resulting in cooling, especially in the higher latitudes. These factors combined to produce an ice age that lasted a few hundred years, but ended as the conditions that caused it waned. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month. Just as Noah and his family entered through the single door of the ark to be saved from the flood, there's only one way of salvation today. Jesus Christ in the book of John says, "I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved." Through his death and resurrection, Christ paid the penalty for our sins, offering salvation to those who will receive him. With so much evidence supporting the historical foundation of the Christian faith, we pray that you will consider following Christ as the only way for salvation. As many as received him, to them gave he power to become children of God, even to them that believe on his name. which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. John 1:12-13.
Conclusion and summary. The flood described in Genesis chapter 6 through 9 isn't a local event, but a global one. A plain reading of the text illustrates this fact. But not only that, we can even find evidence of a global flood all over the planet. I end with this. The Most High has the power to create and destroy. He destroyed the old world so thoroughly that at first glance of our modern world, it looks perfect. But an even greater and perfect world once existed, and through careful examination, we can see that our world is buried under another. The coal and the fossils we find in the ground is a reminder of how much the Most High hates sin, so ponder on that. But I'll also end with this. All of current humanity descends from Noah, the most righteous man of his generation. We all share a forefather who was righteous in the sight of the Most High. So ponder on that as well. Shalom.